This training includes on-screen sign language interpreting and captioning. Audio description is incorporated into the manner in which the training is presented.
This is Module 2 of the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines training. In this module, we will cover the scoping requirements in Chapter 2. In this training module, I will cover each of these scoping areas and point to the applicable technical specifications in either Chapter 3 or Chapter 4. The Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines scope the following: alterations, pedestrian access routes, alternate pedestrian access routes, detectable warning surfaces, pedestrian signal heads and pedestrian activated warning devices, protruding objects and vertical clearance, pedestrian sign, street furniture, transit stops and transit shelters, on-street parking spaces, passenger loading zones, stairs and escalators, as well as handrails. All newly constructed pedestrian facilities and altered portions of existing pedestrian facilities for pedestrian circulation and use located in the public right-of-way must comply with these guidelines. In the Chapter 1 training module, we made the distinction between newly constructed facilities, essentially on greenfield, and alterations which take place on developed land. For clarity, we defined developed as containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or elements. There is an exception to compliance with these guidelines, and that applies to pedestrian facilities within vaults, tunnels, and other spaces used only by service personnel for maintenance, repair, or monitoring of equipment. Exception R201.1 in the final rule was presented as R203, machinery spaces, in the proposed rule. The basic requirement hasn't changed. It's just been moved due to the restructuring of the final rule. Both temporary and permanent pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way must comply with these guidelines. For example, outdoor festival structures or pop-up service counters in the right-of-way, they must comply with applicable provisions. When a pedestrian circulation path or transit stop is temporarily closed by construction, maintenance operations, or similar conditions, an alternate pedestrian access route or transit stop must be provided and comply with R204. I will talk more about the requirements for temporary closed pedestrian circulation paths and transit stops later in the presentation. Buildings, structures, and elements in the public right-of-way that are not covered by PROAG must comply with the applicable requirements in the ADA and AB accessibility guidelines. This sub-provision is not new to PROAG. So some of the buildings and structures that we'd be looking at are park and ride lots, temporary performance stages, and highway rest areas. The final rule requires that where pedestrian facilities are altered, they must be connected by a pedestrian access route to an existing pedestrian circulation path. For example, if a mid-block transit stop is altered, PROAG does not require all the sidewalk walk along the block to be reconstructed to compliance with these guidelines, but it does require a pedestrian access route to tie the altered transit stop to the existing sidewalk. In the final rule, we replaced the phrase maximum extent practicable with maximum extent feasible, which is consistent with the terminology used in the ADA and AB accessibility guidelines. This change is reflected in the sub-provision for existing physical constraints. The board also eliminated right-of-way availability as an example of an existing physical constraint. The board acknowledges that in many cases, regulated entities have the authority to acquire additional right-of-way, which made it a confusing example for an existing physical constraint. Enforcing agencies may provide further information as to any expectations that entities acquire additional right-of-way to meet accessibility requirements. So for existing physical constraints, the requirement is now that in alterations where existing physical constraints make compliance with applicable requirements technically infeasible, compliance is required to the maximum extent feasible. An alteration to pedestrian facilities or elements cannot decrease the accessibility of an existing pedestrian facility or element or an accessible connection to an adjacent building or site below the requirements in these guidelines. This baseline is useful for jurisdictions implementing PROAG in certain alteration scenarios where they must make choices amongst various accessible features to achieve compliance. For example, to add a compliant landing, the slope of an existing curb ramp may need to be increased to the maximum allowable slope. This is an acceptable choice under these guidelines and would not be considered a reduction in access. We added some language to clarify that the exception for alterations to qualified historic facilities is not intended to protect every element of a historic property. Rather, its intent is to protect the historic significance of the facility in general. So for example, the removal of a portion of cobblestones to install a curb ramp that provides access to individuals with disabilities may not necessarily threaten the historic significance of the entire facility. So the provision reads, where the State Historic Preservation Officer or Advisory Council on Historic Preservation determines that compliance with an applicable provision of these guidelines would threaten or destroy the historic significance of a qualified historic building or facility, compliance with that provision is required to the maximum extent feasible without threatening or destroying the historic significance of the qualified building or facility. Provision R203 addresses pedestrian access routes. It covers scoping requirements that explain where pedestrian access routes are required, scoping requirements that point to the technical requirements in chapters 3 and 4, or applicable sections in the ADA and ABA guidelines. It provides clarification for when curb ramps are required at intersection crosswalks, mid-block and roundabout crosswalks, on-street parking, and passenger loading zones. R203 also provides scoping and clarification that when alterations are made to crosswalks, missing curb ramps must be added as part of the alteration. In alterations, a continuous network of pedestrian access routes will be established as pedestrian facilities are altered and brought into compliance with PROAG. In new construction, pedestrian access routes must connect accessible elements, spaces, and pedestrian facilities that are required to be accessible and connect to accessible routes required by ADA or ABA that connect building and facility entrances to public streets and sidewalks. The exception addresses examples such as alterations to a bus boarding and alighting area, not requiring complete reconstruction of the sidewalk all the way to the intersection, but it would require a pedestrian access route to tie into the existing sidewalk. So basically where elements are altered on or adjacent to an existing pedestrian circulation path, the existing pedestrian circulation path need not be altered to provide a pedestrian access route. R203.3 pedestrian circulation paths. This provision essentially requires that where you provide pedestrian circulation paths, you must also provide a pedestrian access route. Transitional segments may be used to connect new or altered pedestrian access routes to existing pedestrian circulation paths, and the differences between adjacent surface characteristics must be minimized to provide a smooth transition. As mentioned in the Chapter 1 training module, the term crosswalks has replaced pedestrian street crossing in the final rule. A pedestrian access route complying with R302 must be provided within and for the full length of a crosswalk, including medians and pedestrian refuge islands. R302 gets you technical specifications such as minimum width, slope, as well as compliance surface requirements. Crosswalks must comply with R306. R306 gets you technical requirements for pedestrian signals where provided, and other crosswalk treatment types for accessible pedestrian crossings. Where a pedestrian circulation path crosses at grade rail tracks, a pedestrian access route complying with R302 must be included within the pedestrian at grade rail crossing. Pedestrian at grade rail crossings must comply with R306. We restructured the layout of the final rule to better articulate where curb ramps and blended transitions are required. We also clarified treatments required at crosswalks where crossing is not intended. So a curb ramp, blended transition, or a combination of curb ramps and blended transitions must be provided in accordance with R203.6 and comply with R304. R304 provides the technical specifications for compliant curb ramps and blended transitions, which are required at crosswalks at an intersection, mid-block and roundabout crosswalks, parallel on-street parking, perpendicular and angled on-street parking, as well as at passenger loading zones. At an intersection corner, one curb ramp or blended transition must be provided for each crosswalk, or a single blended transition that spans all crosswalks at the intersection may be provided. There is an exception in alterations where existing physical constraints make compliance technically infeasible. A single curb ramp complying with R304 is permitted at the apex of the intersection. The exception was previously stated in subprovision R207.2. Jurisdictions that do not wish to provide a curb ramp on the side of the street where no pedestrian circulation paths exist must provide a separation between the pedestrian circulation path and the roadway to indicate to pedestrians that crossing is prohibited. So where no crosswalk is present and a separation treatment exists, curb ramps are not required. Part of subprovision R203.6.1.1 requires that where pedestrian street crossing is prohibited, curb ramps or blended transitions should not be provided, and the pedestrian circulation path must be either separated from the roadway with landscaping or other non-prepared surface, or it needs to be separated from the roadway by a detectable vertical edge treatment with the bottom edge 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. This slide illustrates two acceptable ways in which a jurisdiction can indicate that pedestrian crossing is prohibited. So on the left-hand side, you have an image of the roadway and pedestrian circulation path separated by landscaping. On the right-hand side, you have an image where there is a detectable vertical edge with the bottom edge 15 inches max above the pedestrian circulation path. And that separates the roadway from the crossing. These are just two examples. You can employ other methods to indicate that pedestrian crossing is prohibited, as long as those methods meet the requirements. Similar to crosswalks at intersections, curb ramps or blended transitions must be provided at crosswalks located at mid-block or roundabouts. Where pedestrian crossing is not intended at mid-block or roundabout crosswalks, the same requirements must be met to separate the pedestrian circulation path from the roadway. Parallel on-street parking spaces complying with the dimensions specified in R310.2.1 require a curb ramp or blended transition. And the purpose of that is that it needs to connect to the pedestrian access route or the pedestrian circulation path. The curb ramp or blended transition must be provided at either end of the parking space if needed to connect the parking space to the pedestrian access route. Perpendicular and angled on-street parking and passenger loading zones also require a curb ramp or blended transition to connect the access aisle to a pedestrian access route. R310.2.1, which is mentioned on this slide, is the provision in Chapter 3 that specifies technical requirements for an accessible parallel on-street parking space. Technical requirements will be addressed in the third training module, which covers Chapter 3. I want to point out and also emphasize here that detectable warning surfaces should not be placed on curb ramps or blended transitions that exclusively serve on-street parking spaces or passenger loading zones. R203.6.2 is alterations to crosswalks. This provision provides consistency with Department of Justice and Department of Transportation's 2013 Joint Technical Assistance document on the requirements to provide curb ramps when streets, roads, or highways are altered through resurfacing projects. So basically, when alterations are made to crosswalks, curb ramps or blended transitions must be provided on both ends of the crosswalk where the pedestrian access route crosses a curb. Pedestrian overpasses and underpasses must contain a pedestrian access route complying with R302. R302, as I mentioned, is the provision in Chapter 3 that addresses technical specifications for a pedestrian access route. Where an overpass, underpass, bridge, or similar structure is designed for pedestrian use only, or pedestrian and bicycle use only, and the approach slope to the structure exceeds 1 in 20 or 5%, you have two options. Either provide a ramp complying with R407, or an elevator or limited use, limited application elevator complying with sections 407 or 408 of the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. The only exception to this requirement is in alterations. So in alterations where existing physical constraints make compliance with these two options technically infeasible, a platform lift complying with section 410 of the ADA or ABA accessibility guidelines is permitted. Keep in mind that elevators and LULAs must be unlocked and independently usable during the operating hours of the pedestrian facilities served. Other features that may be part of a pedestrian access route, such as ramps, elevators, platforms, doors, doorways, and gates, must comply with the applicable provisions in PROAG or applicable provisions in the ADA or ABA standards. The scoping provisions for ramps point to R407 in PROAG, and the scoping provisions for elevators, platform lifts, doors, doorways, and gates point to the applicable provisions in the ADA and ABA standards. Provision R203 addressed scoping for pedestrian access routes. So now we're going to look at provision R204, which addresses scoping for alternate pedestrian access routes, alternate transit stops, and alternate passenger loading zones. When a pedestrian circulation path is temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance operations, closure, or other similar conditions, an alternate pedestrian access route must be provided. The alternate pedestrian access route must comply with R303 and R402. In section R303, the board has specified the required accessibility features of an alternate pedestrian access route to ensure that they are detectable and contain basic accessibility features of the closed route without being overly burdensome. There is an exception at R204, and that is if establishing or maintaining an alternate pedestrian access route is technically infeasible due to site conditions or existing physical constraints, an alternate means of providing access for pedestrians with disabilities is permitted. Where accessible transit stops are temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance operations, or other similar conditions, alternate transit stops complying with R309 must be provided. The technical specifications for accessible transit stops can be found in section R309, which will be covered in the third training module. Where a permanently designated passenger loading zone is temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance, operations, or other similar conditions, and a temporary passenger loading zone is provided, it must comply with R311. R311 provides technical specifications for accessible passenger loading zones. Provision R205 provides scoping for where detectable warning surfaces are required. So detectable warning surfaces are required at curb ramps and blended transitions. There is an exception where curb ramps and blended transitions are used exclusively to connect passenger loading zones, accessible parallel on-street parking spaces, access aisles for perpendicular or angled parking spaces to pedestrian access routes. Those curb ramps and blended transitions do not have to have detectable warning surfaces. Detectable warning surfaces are required at pedestrian refuge islands. Because you need at least 2 feet between detectable warning surfaces, in the final rule, we clarified a minimum dimension for a refuge island that must have detectable warning surface. And that is a pedestrian refuge island, which we defined as an area 72 inches long in the direction of pedestrian travel, located between traffic lanes for pedestrian refuge, within a median, splitter island, or channelized island. Detectable warning surfaces are required at pedestrian at-grade rail crossings. This image shows a street with pedestrian at-grade rail crossings that should not have detectable warning surfaces adjacent to the rail. And that's addressed in the exception. The exception states, pedestrian at-grade rail crossings located within a street at a crosswalk should not have detectable warning surfaces adjacent to the rail track. Detectable warning surfaces where the rail track is shared with the vehicular way and running parallel with the vehicular way would have pedestrians who rely on detectable warning surfaces as a hazard warning, potentially standing within the hazardous vehicular way. Other areas where detectable warning surfaces are required include boarding platforms that are not protected by screens or guards along the sides of the boarding and alighting areas facing the transit vehicles. Similarly, at sidewalk and street level rail boarding and alighting areas. Detectable warning surfaces at driveways was discussed in advisory in the proposed rule. The advisory cautioned against detectable warning surfaces at crossings of residential driveways and advocated for detectable warning surfaces at commercial driveways with yield or stop control. In the final rule, detectable warning surfaces are required at driveways controlled with yield or stop control devices or traffic signals. In the final rule, the board has stated that technical requirements for pedestrian signal heads and accessible pedestrian activated warning devices directly in the rule text. So those are no longer referenced through MUTCD. The requirements are now in the rule text. The final rule requires that the accessible features of pedestrian signal heads and pedestrian activated devices be available at all times. This scoping provision applies where pedestrian signal heads and pedestrian activated warning devices are provided. We will revisit these scoping requirements when we cover the applicable technical requirements in Chapter 3. And so these two scoping requirements that we will revisit are for traffic control signals and hybrid beacons with pedestrian signal heads. Their walk indications must comply with R308. Pedestrian signal heads must have a pedestrian push button complying with R307, except for R307.7, or they must have a passive detection mechanism or pre-timed operation that activates both the audible and vibrotactile indications complying with R308. Pedestrian activated warning devices must have pedestrian push buttons complying with R307, except for R307.2 and R307.6, or they must have pedestrian detection that operates audible indications complying with R307.7. Again, we'll go into these technical specifications in the third training module, which covers Chapter 3. Protrusion limits were previously only addressed in Chapter 4. Examples of objects that might protrude in the pedestrian circulation path include, but are not limited to, streetlights, utility poles, equipment cabinets, signposts, signs, parking meters, trash receptacles, public telephones, newspaper vending machines, kiosks, bike racks, planters and planted trees, as well as street sculptures. So regulated entities will need to comply with the requirements for protruding objects when installing or permitting the installation of utilities, trees, awnings, street furniture, and other objects on or adjacent to pedestrian circulation paths. So this provision limits the extent to which objects can protrude horizontally into a pedestrian circulation path, as well as vertical clearance requirements above the pedestrian circulation path. Keep in mind, this provision applies to the full width of the pedestrian circulation paths. And again, there are more technical requirements in R402, which we'll address in the fourth training module. Pedestrian signs are covered in R208, where provided signs intended solely for pedestrians, including transit signs, and all signs serving shared use paths, must comply with requirements for visual characters in R410. In Chapter 4, we will discuss the visual characters technical requirements. Compliance with the technical requirements for some signs would render them too large. Examples of exempted signs include transit schedules, timetables, and maps, signs that are mounted immediately above or incorporated into a push button detector unit. Signage at accessible passenger loading zones has been eliminated in the final rule for consistency with the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines, and also to avoid misinterpretation of the sign as indicating that it's for exclusive use for passengers with disabilities, particularly where there's only one passenger loading zone. Street furniture is scoped in R209. Where provided, street furniture must comply with the applicable technical sections of the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. For drinking fountains, all drinking fountains that are provided in a public right-of-way must comply with section 602.1 through 602.6 of the ABA and ADA accessibility guidelines. All permanent public street toilets must comply with sections 603 through 610. Portable toilet units, so where multiple single-user portable toilet units are clustered at a single location in the public right-of-way, at least 5%, but no fewer than one of each type of the toilet units at each cluster must comply with section 603 and be identified with the ISA symbol. At least 5% of tables at each group of adjacent tables in the public right-of-way, but no fewer than one, must comply with section 902. In buildings, at least one of each type of sales or service counter must comply with technical requirements. In the public right-of-way, each sales or service counter must comply. And that's why we have two exceptions at provision R209.5. One addresses ADA covered buildings and the other addresses ABA covered buildings. The exception reads, sales or service counters that are located in a building subject to the ADA or ABA that is not itself in the public right-of-way, but directly serves the public right-of-way, such as a service window accessed from the sidewalk, may comply with 227.3 or F227.3 of the ADA or ABA accessibility guidelines for scoping. The scoping in R209.6 is for benches, other than those that are part of tables that need to comply with R209.4. The first part of R209.6 scopes benches at transit stops and shelters. Where you have benches at transit stops and shelters, you must provide a clear space. The clear space must be located either on either end of the bench, or if the bench has no end, such as a circular bench, the clear space can either be integral to the bench or no more than 18 inches from the front of the bench. Benches provided within transit shelters must have a clear space entirely within the shelter and located either at one end of a seat or so as not to overlap the area within 18 inches from the front edge of the seat. R209.6.2 scopes benches not at transit stops and shelters. At least 50% of them, but no less than one bench at each group of benches must comply. A clear space located next to either end of the bench, or if the bench has no end, such as a circular bench, the clear space can either be integral to the bench or no more than 18 inches from the front of the bench. Provision R209.7 is intended to scope any other operable parts of other fixed elements used by pedestrians in the public right-of-way. These might include push plates, buttons, handles, pulls, knobs, latches, and locks. Operable parts of other fixed elements to be used by pedestrians must comply with R403. Where provided, transit stops and transit shelters must be accessible per technical requirements in R309. R309 covers technical specifications for accessible transit stops and transit shelters. So where they are provided, they must be accessible per R309. We added a requirement for accessible fare vending machines where they are provided at transit stops and transit shelters. So they must comply with R403 in PROAG, as well as section 707 of the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. Provision R211 scoped on-street parking spaces and includes exceptions. So where provided and metered or designated by signs or pavement markings, accessible parking spaces must be provided according to table R211. There are exceptions. So on-street parking spaces designated exclusively as residential parking, those are exempt. On-street parking spaces designated exclusively for commercial or law enforcement vehicles are also exempt. Note that spaces designated for commercial or law enforcement vehicle use or residential parking only during certain hours are not exempt and must be counted for the purpose of determining the required minimum number of accessible spaces. The last exception is tied to alterations. Where on-street parking spaces are altered, the requirements apply only to the affected parking spaces until the minimum number of accessible on-street parking spaces as specified in table R211 are provided. As mentioned in training module 1, a definition for block perimeter was added to the final rule. So where parking is provided on a block perimeter and it's metered or designated by signs or pavement markings, accessible parking spaces complying with R310 must be provided in accordance with table R211. Where parking is metered or designated by signs of pavement markings, but individual spaces are not marked, each 20 feet of block perimeter where parking is designated must be counted as one parking space. Provision R310 addresses technical requirements for accessible on-street parking. Because there is on-street parking in the public right-of-way that is not on a block perimeter, we clarified scoping requirements in the final rule by having two provisions, one for parking on a block perimeter and one for parking that is not on a block perimeter. The scoping requirements are the same. Table R211, which scopes accessible parking spaces in the final rule, did not change from the proposed rule. Provision R212 scopes passenger loading zones. Where permanently designated passenger loading zones other than transit stops are provided, at least one accessible passenger loading zone must be provided for every continuous 100 feet of loading zone space or a fraction thereof. This includes passenger loading zones permanently designated for rideshare. Passenger loading zones that vary with the time of day or the occupancy of a particular retail store, such as valet stands, that are provided only during certain hours, are not considered permanently designated and are therefore not subject to this requirement. Where provided on pedestrian circulation paths, stairs must comply with technical requirements at R408. Escalators must comply with Section 810.9 of the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. Note that stairs and escalators cannot be part of pedestrian access routes. Although stairs are not part of a pedestrian access route, some pedestrians with certain disabilities will find a short set of stairs more usable than a long ramp. So it is important that stairs conform to accessible design requirements. Handrails are scoped in provision R214. Where handrails are installed on pedestrian circulation paths, including stairs, they must comply with R409. PROAG requires handrails in two places: on ramp runs, not curb ramps, with a rise greater than 6 inches, and on stairs. The board has taken care to ensure that the distinction between ramps requiring handrails and other sloped surfaces not requiring handrails is clear in the final rule. PROAG does not require handrails on curb ramps or along steep sidewalk that is following the grade of the adjacent roadway. This concludes the second training module of the finalized public right-of-way accessibility guidelines. For questions on this module, you can email row@access-board.gov. Join us next for Chapter 3 of the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines Final Rule training modules.